Hi there. My name is Ben Holler. I'm an associate professor of classics here at Virginia Wesleyan University, and I'm here to speak with you today about the Hermeneutics of Love, the loves of Hermes, Mercury in Greek and Roman mythology. You're probably familiar with the Greek god Hermes. You may also know him under his Roman name of Mercury, and you probably know that in either case, in both the Greek and the Roman traditions, he is sometimes known as the god of messengers, god of thieves, liars, and boundaries. Also, after we shuffle off our mortal coils, according to the Greeks, Hermes is also the first face that appears before our eyes. He's the conveyor of the dead to the afterlife, known to the Greeks by the name Psychopompus. He's also a bearer of enigmatic epithets. In Homer, we find names attached to Hermes that we think maybe Homer himself didn't even entirely understand. Names like Argeiafontes and Arionios. We also know him probably as a carrier of a sacred staff. Hermes is known sometimes when we see him in art, as you can see behind me on the Euphroneus crater, by a special stick that he carries, referred to by the Romans as the caduceus and by the Greeks as the kerukeon, or herald wand. You're probably also familiar that from time to time, the Greek and Roman gods were well known for falling in love, often in highly inappropriate and awkward ways. And probably the most famous paragon of this kind of love among the Olympians is Zeus, the king of the gods. You may remember from your days in mythology class names like Metis, Demeter, Hera, Mnemosyne, Thetis, Io, Europa, Callisto, many a name that's attached these days to the moons of Jupiter, because as we probably remember, Jupiter is just another name for Zeus. My job here today, and my goal in choosing Hermes as the subject of my talk, is twofold. One, Hermes is less known than Zeus, and I thought it might be fun for us to talk about some of the lesser known myths from the Greek pantheon. But two, I'd also like to suggest to you that there is a kinder, gentler version of the loves of the gods, which we're not exposed to as much because they're less popular in art and popular culture than some of the other stories which we probably are better familiar with. And I'd like to actually tender kind of a contrarian suggestion as we go through our series of Loves of Hermes today, and that is that sometimes the Greek and Roman gods could be associated with forms of love that was positively altruistic and benevolent, and that at times Hermes is actually viewed by the Greeks as a protector of those in Greek society who are the most vulnerable and the most prone to abuse and neglect. So if we're looking for a Greek version of agape, if we cast our minds back to C.S. Lewis's concept of the four loves, I would argue that in Hermes, as we'll see at the end of the talk, there are actually some cases where we can see Hermes behaving in a way that we might almost characterize as similar to the Christian concept of agapetic love. But first, let's go to our first text for the day, the Homeric hymn to Hermes. Love number 1 is Hermes and Maia, maternal love. Now, we have a hymn dedicated to Hermes, which dates, we think, to maybe about the middle of the 6th century BC. The hymn tells the story of Hermes' birth. And if we look on the vase painting that you have to the right of our text that's on the screen, you'll actually see an image of Hermes, and you'll see a picture of his kerukeon, or herald wand, as this vase painter from ancient Greece imagined it. And on the left, you'll see a woman who's not often portrayed in Greek vases. This is Maia, the mother of Hermes. And there's something interesting about her name that I'd like you to keep in mind for the end of our talk. The name Maia, or the term Maia, is often used by Homeric heroes to address elderly women. It's a term of respect. Oh, Maia. Oh, aged mistress might be one rather awkward and stilted way of rendering the name. Her name also sometimes means foster mother. So Hermes, from his very origins, is associated with a goddess who seems to have something to do with caring for helpless infants. Come back to that in a minute. But first, let's actually look, and just to give you a sound of how these myths are conveyed, I'd like to actually read you the beginning of the Homeric hymn to Hermes, where we get the account of Hermes' birth to the goddess Maia. Hermen humnemus, Dios kai Maia dos huion, Kule nes medeonta, kai Arcadies polymelo, Angelon athanaton, Arionian hon tecamaia, Nymphea el placamos, Dios en philoteti megesa, Aidoi e macaron, de theon e leo tomilon, Antronason iusa, Paliscion enta chronion, Num fea o placamo, mis gescido nuctas amalgo. Offra cataglucus upnos, ec hoela colon on herin, leson athanatus to theus ne tus anthropos. Sing muse of Hermes, son of Zeus and Maia, lord of Mount Cyllene, and of Arcadia, rich in sheep. Messenger of the immortals, bringer of luck, whom Maia bore, a beautiful tressed nymph, mingling in love with Zeus, a revered goddess. But she avoided the gathering of the blessed gods, dwelling inside a well-shaded cave. It was here that the son of Cronos used to make love with the fair braided nymph in the dark of the night, during that time when sweet sleep constrained white-armed Hera. Love number 2, Hermes as matchmaker. Hermes is also someone who's involved in the love affairs of other gods and goddesses. And the most famous instance of this is the one that you see on the slide in front of you. The image that you see is on a pyxis, which is Greek for box, or a cosmetic case, as we see in this case. And if we look very closely, we'll see 2 figures on the screen. We see a figure carrying the Kerykeion, or the caduceus, who must be Hermes. Notice he also has a broad-brimmed hat because it's hot and messengers have to be out in the sun a lot. Next to him, on his right, we see Paris, who is a prince of Troy, who in his early life spends a lot of his time shepherding sheep on the flanks of Mount Ida. We're told that one day, 3 goddesses had a beauty contest. A golden apple was flung in front of them at a wedding feast, and on that apple were engraved the words, "For the fairest." And so Athena, Aphrodite, and Hera all vied to be the most beautiful goddess. But there was just one problem. Most of the gods were far too sensible to judge such a beauty contest. So ultimately, the gods end up sending these 3 goddesses, shepherded by Hermes as the messenger and herald of the gods, down to earth for the last resort, which appears to have been Paris, as a judge for this beauty contest. And of course, each of the goddesses is going to offer bribes. So the goddess Aphrodite offers the winning bribe. And in this case, this is the instance that gives us Hermes as a matchmaker, because the bribe that Aphrodite offers to Paris is going to be a woman who is already married to the king of Sparta, a woman known to history as the face that launched 1,000 ships. I'm referring, of course, to Helen of Troy. So here we see Hermes functioning in the role of a matchmaker, and it's a role that in Greek mythology is going to have devastating consequences. According to the lost Greek epic, the Cypria, the Trojan War, which this incident that we see transpiring on this face provokes, was created by Zeus. It was the will of Zeus, and it was designed in order to exterminate humankind. There were too many of us, and we were too troublesome. So Zeus comes up with the mechanism of the Trojan War as a way of thinning the population. So Hermes can be dangerous as a matchmaker. Love number 3, Hermes can also function as a matchbreaker. And perhaps the most famous instance of this myth is the story of the Thracian bard Orpheus. You may know Orpheus as the famous singer. It's said that his lyre playing and his singing were so mellifluous that trees would uproot themselves to come and sit beside him and listen to the plangent tunes of his playing. He one day decided that he was going to marry a beautiful woman named Eurydice. And as Eurydice was walking across a meadow before their wedding, it said that she was pursued by a beekeeper named Aristaeus and bitten on the ankle by a serpent upon which she had trodden as she fled from his unwelcome advances. Poor Eurydice. So Orpheus, on his wedding day, finds himself a widower. But he has a superpower. He can play the lyre and sing like nobody's business. So Orpheus decides that he's going to make his way down to the land of the dead and actually manages to charm his way into the presence of Persephone and Hades. And his playing really is so beautiful that Persephone agrees to give back Eurydice to Orpheus. There's only one trick. Orpheus isn't allowed to look back as he makes his way to the world above. And Orpheus, of course, is curious as he begins to trudge back up that gloomy road. It was difficult getting down to the land of the dead, and it would be difficult to try again if he's been tricked by Persephone. So at the very last moment, his curiosity and his suspicion overcomes him, and he casts his gaze back and sees what we see on this relief sculpture, which some archaeologists believe was located near the altar of the 12 gods in Athens. On the right-hand side, we see Orpheus. We can recognize him by his lyre in his hand and his Phrygian cap, which is worn by Easterners in Greek art. In the center, we see Eurydice exchanging one last meaningful gaze with her husband before her ghost flutters back to the realm of the dead forever. Finally, on the left, we see Hermes in his role of Psychopompus. Hermes is grabbing Eurydice by the hand and is about to lead her back to the world of the dead because Orpheus has violated the prohibition that was laid upon him. Love number 4. Hermes in love. You may be wondering, Hermes loves his mom, he's involved in all sorts of other love affairs, but does he ever fall in love himself? And the answer is yes. Unfortunately, the results of this are often as disastrous as the love affairs of Zeus. And a great example of this happens early in the royal house of the city of Athens. There is a princess named Herse with whom Hermes falls in love. Unfortunately, poor Herse has a sister named Glauros, who has upset the goddess Athena by violating a different prohibition. In this case, she looked in a basket that Athena told her not to look into. So when Athena finds that Hermes, her brother, is having an affair with Herse, she decides to use this circumstance to get back at poor Glauros. And as the story goes, she goes all the way down to Hades to stir up the goddess of envy and causes Glauros to be envious of her sister. And her envy prompts her to stand in front of Hermes and try to prevent Hermes from entering her sister's bed chamber, at which point Hermes turns Glauros into stone. So Hermes as a lover can be a perilous figure. Love number 5, Hermes the Father of all. Hermes isn't just a lover. He's also, eventually, as tends to happen, a father. One of the most interesting stories we get of Hermes fathering offspring has to do with an affair that he has while he's wandering in his home turf of the region of Greece called Arcadia. While he's wandering not too far from the very cave in which he was born, we're told that Hermes encountered a beautiful nymph who is the daughter of a local native named Dryops. And we're told that he spent the night with Dryops' daughter, and from that union there came about a god who had not the feet that a normal human would be expected to have, but cloven hooves, who had not a regular smooth forehead, but had 2 horns. If this description sounds familiar, it should. In late antiquity, this god was viewed as a potential competitor to Christianity. His name means all, so in late antiquity, pagans tended to hold him up as a god who could rival the all-knowing, all-present deity of the Christians. His name in Greek is Pan. And I'll read you guys very briefly the description that we get in the Homeric hymn to Pan of the way in which Pan comes into being. En togekai theoson, safarot regamelen omeon, andre parathne to thalagarpathos hugros apelthon, num fea uplocamo, turopas philoteti megenai, acta telesse gamon talaron tegaden megaroisen, herme e philanhuion, afar teratopan edestai, aege podein dicarota, philocroton hedu gelota. Here it was that he, Hermes, though a god, tended rough-haired sheep. And at the home of a mortal man, there it came upon him, and sprouted a wet desire to mingle in love with a nymph, the daughter of Dryops. And he accomplished a flourishing marriage, and she bore a dear son to Hermes in the palace, at birth possessing a marvelous countenance to behold, his feet those of a goat, possessing 2 horns, lover of loud noises, and sweet in his laughter. Love number 6, Hermes the Geneticist. Hermes has several children across the course of his career, and some we don't have a chance to talk about, like Bunos, one of the early kings of Corinth, a city known for its business that it plied from its harbors, which opened up on not 1 but 2 seas. But we do have time to discuss one more offspring who's interesting because in some ways he gives us an etion for genetics. Hermes has a son whose name is Hermaphroditus. He's the offspring of Hermes and the goddess of love and beauty. Aphrodite. And one day, Hermaphroditus is wandering in the countryside, and a beautiful nymph named Salmachus catches sight of him from her spring. She tries to grab him. She reaches out her arms. She embraces him, and a strange thing transpires. Hermes' son, Hermaphroditus, and the nymph Salmachus are fused into one body. The Greeks were well aware of the genetic variation that exists across humankind, and they were aware that some offspring, a certain percentage, are born with sexual characteristics of both males and females. And they accounted for this through one of the sons of Hermes, the myth of Hermaphroditus, who himself becomes a hermaphrodite by fusing with the body of a nymph who loves him, one might surmise, a little bit too much. Last but not least, Hermes, the god of precocious babies. We began, and we're also going to end, with the Homeric hymn to Hermes. And I offered at the beginning that one of the functions Hermes has that might surprise us a little bit is that he's not just a lover of women, he's not just a dutiful son, but he's also an altruistic god. We get story after story after story of Hermes helping parents who, living in a time when infant mortality rates are sky high, when pretty much everyone who lived could be expected to have had siblings who had died in childhood, when maternal mortality rates were egregious, Hermes and his story could help to assuage the anxieties of many parents who dreaded going through all of the many difficult decisions that had to be made by parents as they approached the task of bearing children. There are a couple of reasons for this. One, Hermes was a god who in Greek mythology often rescues infants. A famous example of this is Ion, the son of an Athenian princess named Creusa. When she has a child with Apollo, in fear, she abandons the child on the flanks of the Acropolis, and it falls to the lot of Hermes to rescue Ion and prevent him from dying of the elements and the wild animals, which presumably would have torn him limb from limb, and to take him to Delphi, where he's brought up in service to the god. So he's often a rescuer of infants. There are a lot of myths that take this pattern. But also, he's a god of boundaries, and outside the city is where we tend to find those spaces that have to do with what happens when things don't go right in a pregnancy. Outside the city walls in Athens, we find the Kerameikos, which is the graveyard of Athens. Outside the city walls, outside the boundaries of the city, we find the spaces where Athenians who absolutely could not afford or simply were unwilling to raise children exposed those babies to the elements and left them either to be gathered up by slave traders or by kindly people who happened to chance upon them, or be devoured by wild animals. And one of the pieces of evidence I would cite to support this assertion is that if we go back to the beginning, if we go back to the Homeric hymn to Hermes, in the Homeric hymn to Hermes, we discover that one of Hermes' seminal characteristics as a child is that he's the archetypal precocious baby. Hermes leaps out of his crib the day that he's born. He wanders down the street. He kills a turtle. He invents the lyre, the musical instrument, which he'll later give to his brother Apollo. And then he wanders all the way up to the north of Greece, and he kidnaps his brother Apollo's cattle, leads them all the way down to the south of Greece, and then sacrifices the cattle. Aristotle famously tells us that the Athenians had certain fixed intervals before going through the rituals of incorporation for children that made them part of the state and the family, because it was believed that if an infant was going to die, it would often perish during those few crucial first days of life, when it would become evident that perhaps there was a birth defect or perhaps there was some reason that the infant would fail to thrive. So for the Athenians, this was an especially anxious time. And Hermes, in the Homeric hymn to Hermes, gives us reassurance. He gives us a model of what every parent hoped their baby would do. So I hope you've enjoyed our very fast review of some of the adventures that Hermes has in the course of his life. And I hope this talk has prompted you to rethink some of the preconceptions you might have about the Greek gods. Certainly we do get tales of sordid lust and awful things like that, but also we get some stories of gods doing good things and being the benevolent forces that we might, coming from a different era, hope and expect the gods to be. All right, thank you once again for your attention. I'll see you soon.